In this video, you will learn how to create a mobility map. We will use the early life of Louis Armstrong as an example. Louis Armstrong was born August 1, 1901 in New Orleans. He was a trumpeter, composer, vocalist, and actor who was among the most influential figures in jazz. His career spanned 5 decades and different eras in the history of jazz. He passed away on July 6, 1971. Before we dive into the mobility map, let's talk about some helpful tips. Try to do this standing up with a large paper on the wall. Standing up and putting your chin up makes it easier to recall positive memories. Let the person you interview do the drawing. Start with drawing the first house they remember living in. Find the person's network from that time and build it from there. Focus on the positive and good things in that person's life. After all, we are looking for their support network. Ask for stories. Let's pretend we're interviewing Louis Armstrong. Let's make a mobility map for his younger years and learn what good things were going on for him at that time. Louis, what was the first house you remember living in?
I lived in a nice house with my grandmother.
Can you draw that house? Who all lived there?
My grandmother and me.
Can you draw your grandmother and yourself? And can you talk a bit more about your grandmother?
Ever since I was a baby, I had great love for my grandmother. I remember my great-grandmother very well, too. She lived to be more than 90, and I was going to church regularly for both grandma and my great-grandmother were Christian women, and between them, they kept me in school, church and Sunday school.
Can you draw your great-grandmother as well? Do you remember anyone from church, school, or Sunday school?
No, ma'am. I was very young at that time.
Where did you live next?
I lived with my mother, Mayanne, and my sister, who we called Mama Lucy.
How old were you when you started living with Mayanne and Mama Lucy?
I was about 5 or 6 years old.
Can you draw the house and who lived there? Did anyone else ever live in this home?
I had a lot of stepfathers living there or visiting. It was Albert, Slim, Gabe, Tom, and more.
Can you tell me more about your stepfathers?
Albert was not a good guy. Slim was often drunk. Gabe was a good guy. I liked Gabe a lot. Tom worked at the DeSoto Hotel, and when he came home, he brought with him the leftovers from the tables he served. From then, Mayanne would fix a delicious jambalaya for me.
Did you have neighbors?
My uncle, Ike Miles, and 6 cousins lived next door. God bless Uncle Ike. If it weren't for him, I do not know what Mama Lucy and I would have done, because when Mayanne got the urge to go out on the town, we might not see her for days and days. When this happened, she always dumped us into Uncle Ike's lap.
Did you go to school?
Yes, ma'am.
Who do you remember from school?
Walter Martin was my friend. His parents ran the school, and I had a crush on his sister, Wilhelmina. But she passed away before I could tell her.
Who else do you remember from this time?
There were the band players, Buddy Bolden, Bunk Johnson, Henry Zeno, King Joe Oliver, Buddy Petit, and many more.
Where did you live next?
When I was 11 to 12 years old, I went to juvenile, the Colored Waifs Home for Boys.
Who were your caregivers in the Colored Waifs home?
Mr. and Mrs. Jones were the keepers. Mr. Alexander taught how to do carpentry. Mr. Peter Davis taught music and gave vocational training. He was a good teacher, but first he hated me. But then he warmed up to me, grew in love for me. He gave me a lot of time. Mr. Davis gave me a cornet and taught me how to play Home Sweet Home. Then I was in 7th heaven, and one day he said to me, "Louis, I am going to make you a leader of the band."
Who did you spend your free time with?
Willie Davis was the fastest runner. Isaac Smooth, or Ike, we both played in the band. Jimmy, his bathing trunks fell off in the water. Red Son, he was known for stealing.
What is your favorite memory of your friends?
I remember a story about Red Son. Every time he was released, he stole something and came back to the home. One day when he was out, he came to visit us on a horse. Said he had been working and earned a horse. We all admired him. Red spent the whole day with us, letting us all take turns riding this horse. After dinner, the next evening, Red's son came back in. He had been arrested for stealing a horse.
Who else was important at this time of your life?
Mayanne and Mama Lucy came to see me 3 times a week. My father had never paid me a single visit.
Is there anything else you would like to tell us about the Waifs' home?
The place was more like a health center or a boarding school than a boys' jail. I am proud of the days I spent at the Colored Waifs' home for boys. I was unhappy to leave.
Where did you live next?
I was released from the Colored Waifs' home on the conditions that I would live with my father and stepmother. Willie Armstrong is my father. He was a common laborer who never had anything all his life. Gertrude is my stepmother. She turned out to be a very fine woman, and she treated me just as though I was her own child. For that alone, I will always love her. They were happily married, and they had 2 boys. Willie was an ornery as they come. He deliberately would do any and everything he could to upset everybody. He was a terrible liar. Henry was nice. He was very kind to me at all times, and we became good friends. While I was living with them, my stepsister Gertrude was born. I left shortly afterwards because father decided that he was just earning enough to support his 3 children by my stepmother. And that's how I moved back in with my mother in my old house.
What age were you when you moved back in with your mother?
I lived there from age 13 to 18. I remember many people from this time.
Can you tell us the most important people you remember from this time?
Well, yes, ma'am. Mayanne, my mother. Mayanne taught me how to cook her best dishes. Her jambalaya was delicious. Mama Lucy, my sister, she moved to Florida when she was a large teenager, but sometimes came to visit. I loved her. Stepdaddy Gabe was an old hand at the Andrews Coal Company and got me a job there. Gabe was the best stepdaddy I ever had. Every time things went bad with me, I had the coal cart to fall back on. Thanks to good stepfather Gabe, I sure did like him. I took a job with Morris Konofsky. That job was easier than at the coal company, and I stayed with Morris for a long time. I got a job at the Honky Tonk. The boss man's name was Henry Pons. Henry Pons and Joe Segreta were deadly enemies. One day, 3 tough boys from Joe Segreta tried to shoot Henry Pons. Henry Pons got after them and shot all 3 of the colored boys who were taken to hospital for treatment. It took me days to get over that shock.
Let's pause here for a second. This was a real traumatic experience for Lewis. Mobility mapping is not meant to be a therapy session, but it might bring up emotions for the person being mapped. It is important to acknowledge the emotions that come up. Whatever emotion they feel is okay. Ask the person if they'd like to depict this on their map, and if so, how. Then move on. Yes, that sounds very rough. How would you like to show this incident on your map?
Let me draw my face in shock.
Is there anything else you would like to say about Henry Pons?
Yes, ma'am. Pons was a mighty man. When you are talking about real operators who really played it cool, think of Henry Pons. Black Benny was one of the best all-around drummers that ever paraded New Orleans. He was serving time in jail frequently. It was always for some minor offense such as disturbing the peace. He never served more than 30 days at a stretch. Black Benny was the musician's friend, ready to come to aid of the underdog. Black Benny became my protector and guide. Slippers could fight fair and he could fight dirty, whichever his victim preferred. But he was as nice a fellow as God ever made. I loved him just as though he had been my father. Whenever I was around fellows like Slippers and Black Benny, I felt secure. Just to be in their company was like heaven to me. Cousin Flora Miles was running around with strange kids and a white guy made her pregnant. Flora got a baby boy who she named Clarence. I became Clarence's caregiver. When Clarence was about 2 years old, Flora must have felt that she was going to die, for just before she passed away, she made his name Clarence Armstrong and left him in my care. Sarah Ann Miles, Flora's sister, was a jolly lady with a big heart who did everything in her power to make people happy. She had a great sense of humor, and I loved her. I formed a little jazz band with Joe Lindsay as drummer, Morris French on the trombone, and Louis Prevost, who played clarinet. Joe Lindsay was my bosom pal. Kid Ory and Joe Oliver came together and made the hottest jazz band that had ever hit New Orleans. I often ran errands for Joe Oliver's wife, Stella Oliver. Miss Oliver became attached to me and treated me as if I were her own son. Joe would give me lessons for my pay. I could never stop loving Joe Oliver. He was always ready to come to my rescue when I needed someone to tell me about life and its little intricate things and help me out of difficult situations. Mid-1918, Joe and Stella moved to Chicago. Kid Ory then asked me to take Joe Oliver's place in the best jazz band in town. What a thrill that was. Daisy Parker was my first wife. Daisy was 21 and I was 18. We found a 2-room flat in uptown New Orleans. Clarence was living with us. Whenever Daisy and I had a fuss, Clarence and I would move down to my mother's house intending to stay there forever. But then I ended up going back with Daisy again until Joe called for me and I moved to Chicago to play in Joe Oliver's band.
With his move to Chicago, we have covered the entire childhood of Louis Armstrong. We know about all the people he has lived with. We know about his neighbors, schools, and friends, and even about many band players. Now it's time to finalize this mobility map. Louis, you knew so many people. Can you draw a symbol beside those people you feel a special connection with, a heart connection, who are especially good to you?
Yes, ma'am. I already have circled some of the people I hold dear, and I'll circle the others also. I especially love my grandmother and my great-grandmother, Uncle Ike, and the Martin family, Mr. Davis, Kid Ory, Slippers, and Joe Lindsay.
Can you draw a symbol beside those people who were not good to you?
Yes, ma'am. I would give them a sad face. My stepfather was not good to Mayanne. I saw Albert almost kill my mother. And my stepbrother Willie and Daisy also were pains to me.
Can you draw a symbol beside those people you are curious about, who you would like to know more about?
Yes, ma'am. I wish I knew more about my grandmother and my great-grandmother and had spent more time with them. They loved me and I loved them.
Is there anything else you want to say about this map?
No, ma'am. This looks right.
We now have finished the mobility map. The mobility map gives you a good idea where to look for support for the child and their parents. Let's now talk about a few caring things we can do before we leave. Sometimes there are so many houses and there is so much information that it is too much for one session. A teenager can probably work for about 1 hour and an adult for 2 hours. It is fine to continue on another day. Discuss who gets to keep the map. Take a picture for your file if the youth wants to keep it. It's best practice to ensure that the person being mapped has a support person available to them in the time following the mapping in case anything does come up for them. It can be useful to ask the child to write down 1 to 5 things that they think they need most right now to be the happiest they could be. To end on a positive note, it might be useful to ask the youth to finish with 5 things that make them awesome or that they are good at. Be ready to jump in with things you like about the child if needed. Don't let the possibility of the parent or child feeling negative feelings keep you from using this tool. Most likely you will find that the parent or child you have interviewed is grateful for you taking the time to get to know them. It is useful for them to process their past with you. It will help them with their grief. We hope you have enjoyed watching this video. We wish you success in learning more about the children and families you work with. Keep looking for how to reconnect the children with their relatives and other emotional supports. Remember that parents need support as well. Feel free to subscribe to my channel and watch other videos that might be useful for you or your work. Thank you for all you do.
I mean, that's what I'm talking about. Want to go home.